the webinar, I would like to acknowledge our work in Chiochake, Montreal, takes place in the unceded indigenous land of Kanien'kehá:ka, which is the Mohawk Nation. Kanien'kehá:ka is known as a gathering place for many First Nation, and we recognize that the Kanien'kehá:ka as custodian of the lands and water on which we gather today. One of the ways that the system perpetuates discrimination is through the passing down of taking for granted norms and narrative through generation. Hence why it is important for us to bring counter-narrative into the space, and Montreal in Action takes great effort into bringing anti-colonial practice into the space that we open to you all today. Rapidement, donc comme Balarama l'avait dit, on est moitié en anglais, moitié en français, donc je vais continuer en français. J'aimerais tout d'abord remercier toutes les personnes qui sont là aujourd'hui et qui ont aussi fait un don lorsqu'ils se sont enregistrés pour ce cours. Petit ou grand, ça nous permet de soutenir les webinaires et nos programmes éducatifs. Nos webinaires sont ouverts au grand public et sont gratuits en tout temps et sont dédiés à augmenter en fait la conscientisation publique sur les questions qui sont liées à la discrimination et au racisme systémique, et on souhaite en fait avec ça instiller un changement. Et rapidement, toutes les donations qu'on génère via nos webinaires sont réinvesties dans notre programmation éducative, comme je viens de le mentionner. Rapidement, je vais mettre le lien GoFundMe pour ceux qui souhaitent nous faire un don dans le chat en dessous. Et rapidement, le timing de l'événement aujourd'hui, donc ça va être environ 45 minutes où est-ce que Dr. Adelle Blackett va nous présenter le sujet. Et ensuite, on va laisser un temps environ plus ou moins une trentaine, quarantaine de minutes pour les questions. Donc, je laisse la parole à Dr. Blackett. Dr. Blackett, I will leave you to speak. Thank you.
OK, c'est bon?
Oui.
Donc, merci infiniment, Ariane, pour cette belle introduction. Merci beaucoup à Balarama pour l'invitation à venir vous parler aujourd'hui. Et je tiens à vous remercier tous les deux et Montréal en Action pour le travail névralgique que vous faites pour faire ressortir une action concertée autour des questions de la discrimination et de l'inclusion sociétale, dont le rapport dont je vais vous parler en est une. Thank you also for the land acknowledgement, and which is absolutely fitting. And one of the things that we're also reckoning with in this moment is dealing with the legacies that are intertwined between settler colonialism and slavery. And so as someone who teaches at McGill, I think it's important also to acknowledge that McGill University was built on the profits from the slave trade, as James McGill was a West Indian merchant, and Indigenous and Black slaves at McGill. And so part of coming to terms with a topic like the one I'll speak to you today, employment discrimination, is just to think about the legacies of settler colonialism and slavery on how we think about the world of work, and how, frankly, certain legacies of the past continue to live in the occupational segmentation that persists. So we'll start with a reflection that comes from the Supreme Court of Canada. And it is a framing on the meaning of work in our society that very much characterizes its fundamental character in persons' lives, and the fact that it means so much, certainly a means of financial support, but it's also part of being a contributor to society. And Chief Justice DICKSON framed it as an essential component of a person's sense of self-worth and emotional well-being. And so in light of that, the conditions of the work are highly significant in shaping the whole, the psychological, the emotional, the physical elements of the person's well-being and self-respect. And I often, those who have taken employment law or labor law with me know that I often bring this out very early because it frames the significance of work in our society. In our current moment, it seems almost as if we're, with the COVID-19 pandemic, in a moment where this critical character of not only work, but work that we're now referring to as essential work has hit home. And so workers who have historically been marginalized and whose work has been taken for granted are all of a sudden acknowledged to be central to just the very functioning of our society. And COVID-19, of course, has, by spotlighting essential workers, also spotlighted the deep and persisting occupational segmentation on the basis of race. It's made that unavoidable, unmistakable, and in the context of some would say a resurgence, certainly a perpetuation of anti-Black violence that surrounded this moment. The denial that systemic racism flies in the face, of course, of the stratification that is structural and that we continue to see. This image that I'm sharing is an image that Le Devoir published. And the image was part of the campaign around what we've referred to as les anges gardiens in the hospitals in particular, but as we know, in a number of other poorly paid, under-resourced areas, and that are inhabited by a disproportionate number of members of the Black community. And this image was part of a campaign for those who seek asylum and have claimed permanent residency on the basis that their work is essential. They've put themselves at tremendous risk, and the minimum we could do as a society is afford permanent residency. The campaign, of course, has resonated. There's been some legislative change, but that's not why I've put this image here. This image, of course, says so much. Beautiful young girl holding a sign addressed to our political leaders. But the sign says something about her and her future in this place. And that shook me. We know there's a disproportionate number of racialized community members, in particular Black community members, doing the hard work that we acknowledge to be essential. But what are this young girl's life options? What are we saying about the future for other young men and women? are we, as a society, perpetuating the kind of segmentation that we committed to challenging decades ago? And so I want this image to stay with you as we work through the discussion of employment discrimination and why we put so much attention on this field, where we are as a society and where we think we're going. And let me underscore that this is not new. So one of the human rights cases rendered 15 years ago by the Quebec Human Rights Tribunal, and that bothered me in a very similar way, Centre MARAICHER EUGÈNE GUIGNOIS, involved day workers of Haitian descent in agriculture who were organized by the Union des Producteurs Agricoles to go on to local farms. In this case, they actually were permanent residents. And one case, one of the workers was a Canadian citizen. They worked the same kind of exploitative conditions that we know characterize the agricultural sector. In addition, they faced segregation on the basis of race. And I use that word advisedly. These workers were literally expected to use separate washroom facilities, separate kitchen facilities. The decision begins with words like, "This case happened here in Quebec in 2001. So the decision, of course, found that there were human rights violations. How could it not? What it didn't do, though, was challenge precisely the structural factors that enabled the occupational segmentation to continue. It remained invisible in a way that, dare I say, in this current moment, despite our broadened awareness to the work of essential workers, racialization remains invisible in the sense that it is not challenged. We're not asking ourselves why it is this overrepresentation persists, why it is our human rights legislation is not leading to the kind of change we would need. So the challenges then become challenges of a structural nature. Challenges to the entrenched subordination and social stratification that we witness in our society. And in this regard, while permanent residency is, of course, crucial, permanent residency does not erase in and of itself that social stratification, the persistence of status, racialization as a form of status that and other markers of identity that are at the core of our anti-discrimination legislation as the basis of identifying who should do what work, who is expected to do what work in our society. So fast forward to the Office de consultation publique de Montréal et le rapport rendu en juin sur le racisme et la discrimination systémique. Un rapport qui a pris le soin, suite à des présentations sur la discrimination en matière d'emploi, en 2019 et une série d'interrogations qui ont suivi. Pensons donc aux solutions qu'on apporte. Une des choses qui a mené certainement l'action par votre regroupement auprès de la ville, c'est le fait que la ville non seulement a un rôle de guide envers la société, la ville est elle-même une des plus grandes employeurs de la région de Montréal, avec 26 000 employés. Et donc, a un rôle névralgique à jouer à assurer ce genre d'intégration dans le marché du travail et à des niveaux différents. Mais voici le bilan de l'Office de consultation publique de Montréal sur les mesures visant à diversifier les membres du corps des employés de la ville. Et je cite, « Le discours normatif et généreux, des déclarations, des motions, des manifestations d'action, excuse-moi, j'arrive pas à tout lire parce que oui, voilà. Les motions des plans d'action de la ville disent s'attaquer au phénomène du racisme ou de la discrimination, mais les résultats se font attendre. Les divers témoignages entendus et l'analyse des documents mis à la disposition de la commission révèlent des lacunes au niveau des données, de la culture d'évaluation, de l'imputabilité et de la reddition de comptes. C'est pourquoi la Commission en appelle à un redressement vigoureux qui demandera une réelle volonté politique et un engagement tout aussi important des services et arrondissements. Donc, la ville, l'OCPM plutôt demande à la ville de renforcer son prochain plan d'action, entre autres, pour la diversité en emploi. Et elle recommande à son 11e recommandation de fixer des cibles de représentativité contraignantes à son échéance. Et elle demande à ce que ces cibles soient spécifiques pour chacun des groupes visés par un programme d'accès à l'emploi et différencié selon la catégorie d'emploi. Et elle demande également à ce que la ville s'assure que la représentativité se reflète aussi bien à la ville-centre que dans les arrondissements. Et il y a des dimensions donc un peu plus techniques qui iront appuyer cette recommandation de la ville. Mais ce que je tiens à souligner à cet égard, parce que nous sommes en 2020, c'est qu'il n'y a rien dans cette recommandation qui est littéralement ou réellement nouvelle. Et on pourrait se demander pourquoi nous sommes toujours en train de discuter de ça, de cette façon, quand nous sommes entourés de codes et de chartes introduits dans la législation canadienne et québécoise depuis les années 60, 62 pour l'Ontario, 70 ou 75 pour la Charte québécoise des droits de la personne et liberté, et des années 80, comme on sait, pour la Charte canadienne et pour l'article 15 qui est rentré en vigueur en 85. Donc, ce n'est pas nouveau. Et si ce moment de reconnaissance de l'importance de Black Lives Matter devrait nous enseigner quelque chose, c'est que la justice n'est pas unidirectionnelle. Nous pouvons reculer en matière des droits de la personne et de l'inclusion sociale. Et donc, l'heure est de reconnaître que nous pourrons justement reculer si nous ne prenons pas d'actions décisives et je dirais aussi des actions qui se démarquent de ce que nous avons préconisé par le passé. And here I want to pause and frame competing views on employment discrimination, which in some ways I think have had an impact in blunting some of why or how it is that the measures themselves seem not to have been deployed in ways that actually lead to the kind of results that one would expect. And so the external view, and you've all heard it in various forms put forward, but that has tended to underlie much of what happens on employment discrimination, is that discrimination is essentially a barrier to productivity. To eradicate it, to address it, would be to make the labor market more efficient. But there's no actual calling in question of the way that we understand or structure markets. So employment discrimination law steps in, but it's merely corrective of existing market failures. Whereas an alternative vision, which I'll refer to as an internal vision, actually takes discrimination as inherent to labor markets and to our market economy. And it draws on a long line of thinking and is deeply consistent with critical race theory approaches to employment discrimination, and indeed to the movement beyond, speaking of employment discrimination. And here I've just listed Cedric Robinson's work in that of Eric Williams, as well as the work of cultural theorist Stuart Hall, which situates our understanding of racialization in a longer history and sees it as essential to the development of capitalism, and so literally refers to the notion of racial capitalism. And in Stuart Hall's account, of course, this framing acknowledges and takes into account the way in which gender, class, ethnicity, race, sexual identification, orientation are framed, and how they center or frame the periphery and the center along these markers, along these factors of market demarcation. And under this view, and in Stuart Hall's words, capitalism actually advances on divided terrain. And if this is the approach adopted, then employment discrimination law, to be effective, has to be more than merely corrective. It needs to center societal transformation. And I want you to hold on to that difference as we work through some of what's happened over the past series of decades with our laws, which haven't, as I've said before, changed that much. And so the Office de Consultation Publique de Montréal's recommendations are very much in line with the kind of work that current Justice of the Supreme Court, Rosalie Abella, wrote about in 1984 when she chaired the Royal Commission on Equality and Employment, and that sought through measures that would address the underrepresentation of 4 designated groups in the workforce, so women, Indigenous people, racialized communities, and people living with disabilities, that these measures, according to Abella, would need to be result-focused. They could not be voluntary. There was enough to see that voluntary measures were insufficient to move toward a substantive equality in the workplace, and instead a data-based approach was necessary and was encouraged. And from her report, employment equity should be seen as a strategy to obliterate the effects of discrimination, to open equitably the competition for employment opportunities to those arbitrarily excluded from it, required a special blend of what's necessary, what's fair, and what is workable, she said. But the key is that it's not that individuals in those groups are inherently unable to achieve equality on their own. It's that the obstacles in their way are so formidable and self-perpetuating that they cannot be overcome without intervention. And so it's both intolerable and insensitive, she wrote, if we simply wait and hope that the barriers will disappear with time. And so she made the case for equality in employment as happening only if it was made to happen. These words, this framing has been reaffirmed since, including by the Supreme Court of Canada in a case brought against CN by Action Travail des Femmes, and that underscored systemic discrimination as discrimination that results from the simple operation of established procedures of recruitment, hiring, and promotion, none of which is necessarily designed to promote discrimination, end of quote, and underscored again in one of the rare, frankly, systemic discrimination cases brought forward, this time at the Quebec Court of Appeal in 2011 in Gaz Métropolitaine, and which adopted a definition by the president of the Quebec Human Rights Tribunal, Juge Rivet. And so the background is there, the framing is there, and the legislation is there. So we have the federal employment equity legislation, which covers a range of federally regulated private sector actors, from banking to finance, communication, transportation. And the purpose as well is to achieve equality so that persons aren't denied employment opportunities or benefits, and for reasons unrelated to ability, and it seeks to correct conditions of disadvantage in the workplace that prevent, again, women, Indigenous people, people living with disabilities, and members of racialized minorities. The legislation refers to the language of visible minorities, but to change the conditions for those groups. And the Canadian Human Rights Commission has a crucial role to play in monitoring the implementation of those plans, but there's also been a catalyzing role for particular sectors, including banking, to move forward on these issues. There's also the framework in the Quebec context with both the Quebec Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms, which from Article 86 on addresses employment equity that may be either voluntary or following an investigation of the Commission. Similarly, there's an act respecting equal access to employment in public bodies, 2001 legislation, which covers the groups that I've previously mentioned, as well as another category referred to as ethnic minorities, and defined as persons whose mother tongue is neither French nor English and who belong to a group other than the Aboriginal Peoples Group or the Visible Minorities Group. And so the Act applies to these groups, and the OCPM's report addressed these groups. The Commission, the Quebec Commission des droits de la personne et droits de la jeunesse, has an important monitoring role to play here. But there are long-standing and persisting concerns about the way in which that monitoring has taken place in Quebec by the Commission. And you will have seen just this week a response by Phonemi of CRAR on addressing the real challenges faced in relation to the Commission, and raising long-standing concerns about the Commission's representativeness. But the legislative framework is there. The question then is, what's happened? Have we come to a place where we're seeing movement in terms of effects? And not surprisingly, there is some change, some movement across groups in different contexts. In the federal context, in the 2018 report, there's even a report, a suggestion that for women and visible minorities, there are, depending on occupational category, actual representation or above 100%, even though when one considers that alongside labor market availability, there's some variation. And underrepresentation for Indigenous communities and for people living with disabilities. But if one were to take those categories as presented without doing the hard work of intersectional analysis, who's where, and without doing the critical work of disaggregation that I think has become all the more apparently necessary in this moment, certain groups, for example, Black members of the society, get lost in the way that the categories are currently framed. And so underrepresentation can be masked. And of course, then when one disaggregates further and takes intersectionality seriously, and you look at, well, how do Black trans women with disabilities fare? You know, you're unlikely to be doing well at all. And so the need to be more attentive, dare I say, more sophisticated in the way that we think about the way that discrimination happens in the workplace and how we address it is crucial. And you'll see that I've put here two international sources: the United Nations Durban Declaration on Racism from 2001, a pivotal document that calls for disaggregation, and a recent general observation on racial discrimination at work by the UN Specialized Agency on Employment, the International Labor Organization, similarly encourages disaggregated data gathering and doing so in a manner that's respectful of confidentiality. And I underscore this because this is also something that community groups have been really careful to be asking for. It's important to, if we're looking seriously at whether we're actually making progress on anti-discrimination law, to be taking that seriously. Donc, pour retourner au rapport, le rapport mentionne un cas qui est spécialement intéressant, le cas de la STM, Société de transport de Montréal, qui a depuis s'est embarqué sur un processus largement considéré comme assez sérieuse de mise en œuvre d'une politique d'accès à l'emploi et de vraiment accroître le nombre de personnes racisées, femmes, dans l'emploi, dans les différentes catégories d'emploi à la STM. Et leur bilan sur leur plan qui était en vigueur entre 2015 et cette année, 2020, on voit qu'avec leur effort, ils ont réussi à avoir 48% des personnes embauchées par la STM qui font partie de ces groupes. Et là, il faut comprendre qu'il y a un peu, on a mis des groupes ensemble, donc gardez à l'esprit ce que je viens de mentionner sur la désagrégation. Mais on est à 48% des personnes issues de minorités visibles, minorités ethniques et personnes autochtones. Et c'est le CPM qui fait le contraste avec la ville de Montréal, où en 2017, ce chiffre se situait beaucoup plus bas. Donc, cette statistique vient confirmer la possibilité de mieux faire, qu'il y a des exemples quand il y a une politique activement mise en œuvre, qui a des cibles identifiées, des échéanciers réels qui viennent appuyer les démarches. OK. Laissez-moi souligner une décision quand même importante de 2013 et qui concerne justement les questions de discrimination en matière d'emploi à la Ville de Montréal. C'est important aussi parce que c'est une décision de la Cour supérieure du Québec qui reconnaît la discrimination systémique sur la base de la race ou le racisme systémique. Et donc, ça concernait M. TANISMA, qui était employé à la Ville de Montréal, hautement qualifié et qui cherchait à de nombreuses reprises à avoir une promotion au rang de cadre à la Ville. Et ces efforts sont détaillés dans la décision. Ils ont été plutôt systématiquement écartés. Et il a mené donc une bataille qui était longue, douloureuse. Donc, à un certain niveau, on pourrait dire que la Cour supérieure, le juge Peacock, lui a donné raison. Mais si vous regardez la décision, en détail, vous comprendrez que excusez-moi, vous comprendrez que les revendications n'ont pas été, ben, le montant des dommages était relativement bas. Ce que je souligne, et évidemment, ça ne rentre pas dans le raisonnement juridique du juge Peacock, qui a essentiellement affirmé la jurisprudence que je viens de vous mentionner sur la discrimination en matière d'emploi. Mais ce qui frappe, c'est son constat sur ce que ça a impliqué pour M. TANISMA d'avoir à mener ce long bataille juridique. And I'll quote, he said, "The court observed Mr. Tanisma's demeanor. Throughout the hearing, he spoke, looked, and acted like a broken man. His testimony demonstrated that after giving loyal and devoted service to his employer, he felt that his loyalty had been betrayed." And the toll of employment discrimination and the toll of having to fight employment discrimination through individualized battles through the commission and then through the courts when necessary, as it became necessary for Mr. Tanisma, should just not be underestimated. And I'm going to get to that toward the end of my presentation on as we think beyond. But let's think about our frameworks, right? And so I put this image up. You've doubtlessly seen it before. And usually you're supposed to look at the first image and say, yeah, okay, I see the problem with that. That's formal equality. We treat everyone the same. But that doesn't really help if you're not the same height. And so the substantive equality frame gives different boxes to different people depending on their need or specificity, and that allows everyone to see over and watch the game, right? And I think, like many, this image has always troubled me in its framing of what the aspirations are when we think through equality. Let me mention another case that I think helps to explain some of the problem with this, and it's a core case, a case that's relied on in TANISMA and in most equality litigation, and is a central case for thinking through what we mean by moving beyond a framework that individualizes rather than a framework that thinks systemically about discrimination, how to change it in the workplace. And this case is often colloquially referred to by the name of its the plaintiff, Ms. Majoren, who was a firefighter in a heavily male-dominated industry, and actually was on the job and did her job well for many years. And then a ministry introduced a test to find or identify optimal firefighting skills. And in the last set of tests put in place, there were hardly any women in the testing sample. So they basically made a test that's supposed to apply universally to men and women, but they essentially used men to establish their aerobic standard. And when applied, then Ms. Majoren failed the test repeatedly, as would, given the testing of the test, most women. And so this provided for the Supreme Court of Canada an opportunity to really think seriously about the tests that were being applied on assessing the justification, if you will, for measures that were framed as neutral from the start. And what they wound up doing was challenging that starting principle. Why would we assume that the test was neutral from the start, right? And then simply ask how to fit Ms. Majoren into it. How many boxes does she need to see over the fence? Is that really the question we're asking, right? When we're seeking to determine whether to legitimate action. And instead, the Supreme Court argued that employers must, and I'm quoting here, build conceptions of equality into workplace standards by enacting human rights statutes and providing that they're applicable to the workplace. The legislators have determined that the standards governing the performance of work should be designed to reflect all members of society insofar as it is reasonably possible. And so a shifting of the understanding of the standard and a need to reimagine so that we're actually taking into account the unique capabilities, inherent worth and dignity of all up to the point of undue hardship. So there should have been tremendous potential in this decision. In its capacious framing, much of it needed to be worked through, and instead has been largely blunted out. So much so that increasingly the work of some scholars, including my colleague, Professor Vrinda Narain, profoundly challenges the very notion that we should be using accommodation at all as a framework of inclusion. If accommodation comes to mean assimilation, right? So back to that starting framing, here are we just talking about more boxes so that everyone can see over that fence? Or is there an alternative vision that we're looking for? And so this image starts with the four, but invites us to be thinking differently about what employment discrimination law might look like if we were thinking about inclusion more broadly or liberation. I've tended in my own work to refer to the language of emancipation, and I'd invite you to think that it could mean that we're playing a different game, or we're playing the game differently. not just joining. So if we're thinking from a framework that centers societal transformation, then we're actually thinking about something different. It entails naming and engaging seriously with systemic discrimination, including systemic racism. And frankly, in refusing to be called, this is a bit of a parenthesis, but to be called to debate whether systemic discrimination and systemic racism is real in the face of so much that at a societal level and at a jurisprudential level is already there. It entails broadly infusing a substantive equality framework throughout our understanding of the employment relationship and how we understand that. And it entails acknowledging that the nature of the game we're playing must be understood to change. And I'm going to spell that out a little bit. But let me do that first by looking at how substantive human rights law is emerging in a way that takes us beyond individual human rights codes, or in the Quebec context, the Quebec Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms. How does human rights law allow us to go to that broader place? And here I'll mention a challenging case, a case that's not without its interest, frankly, in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, but it concerns a very technical, very specific regime within occupational safety and health legislation, but that as applied to a teacher who is not a regular classroom teacher, but a supply teacher who's pretty much on call and has to make herself available for work, who also, so this teacher who also happens to be pregnant, and who is kind of at risk if she steps into an elementary school with lots of kids who might get ill. So if she's offered a placement, she kind of can't really say, I'm going to go in. And what the case does, in a nutshell, is to say, wait a minute, why are we focusing on her instead of the workplace itself? Right? This is occupational safety and health legislation. We should be thinking about the hazard for a pregnant woman, and in thinking about the legislative purpose in a manner that's inspired by a more, shall I say, transformative understanding of human rights law, where the specific scheme is understood to, and it's Justice Abella again for the court, to offer an effort to prevent the discriminatory exclusion of women from the workplace based on pregnancy. So that becomes the starting point. And the scheme then is intended to protect pregnant women who have a contract to work, and to then enable them to be able to withdraw from an unsafe workplace without leading to the anomalous conclusion that her withdrawal on the safety concerns is actually what prevents her from having an employment contract in the first place. So a shift, and there are other cases that are more explicit about the application of a human rights framework to the way that we think about other legislative texts, and the Supreme Court of Canada's Caron decision is one strong example of this. And so moving beyond a narrow vision of what anti-discrimination legislation is meant to do, with a broader vision of what human rights are about. And so this leads us to look at employment discrimination law differently, to think about it in terms of broader understandings of societal transformation, and to think about it as part and parcel of how we look at the workplace and the range of structures that regulate the workplace with a view to broadening our understanding of how the work is to be understood, is to be carried out, and remain open to the prospect that workplaces are going to change if one is really adopting an inclusive approach, that they're not going to stay the same, and that society as a whole is likely to benefit. And in many ways, the way that we think about the issue of disability in particular, and calls for universal design as stepping far beyond a reasonable accommodation framework, but stepping into a framework that broadens the range of who is seen as belonging in the workplace, that these approaches allow us to think very differently about the objectives and then about the results that we're needing to have. A further part, and I want you to think back to Mr. TANISMA and what that litigation on an individualized basis meant. And bear in mind, he was litigating because the employment equity strategies, which are meant to be more collective, were failing him, right? He wasn't being included. So this kind of reminds us of why, when we think about employment discrimination and think about legal strategies for change, we need to be thinking quite resolutely about collective mobilizing and, dare I say, collective resistance behind it. This is critical to the way that we think about labor law as a field, and needs to infuse the way that we think about employment discrimination as well. And so, in this sense, Montréal en Action's political work, activist work, of bringing the matter to a space that would undertake a systemic analysis and then insisting on implementation, is precisely that kind of work, and keeping the spotlight on this. Because otherwise, the recommendations, like the recommendation I read to you, which is really no different than the kind of recommendation we've seen a generation or two ago, can lead to little more than performativity, right? So it's the organizing that must surround any form of social action for transformation. I want to say in conclusion just a little bit about this particular moment as well. So the COVID-19 moment, as I intimated at the beginning, is a moment where we're seeing things that of course we could have seen before, but that are particularly centered. And there's a risk that what will happen is that we'll continue on with the same old strategies, and things will find their way back into the courts, and that might lead to some incremental change, but not more structural change. And so in this moment where communities, again, are organizing to support essential workers, to listen to their claims and listen to their demands, I'd like to say that this is an opportunity also to just be thinking bigger about what the asks are around the kind of labor market segmentation that I led this discussion with, and that essential workers embody. And so alternatives there mean, of course, thinking about status, permanent residency when it's not available, but also thinking beyond the box of employment-centered responses, And so the particularly interesting dimension around CERB, the specific benefits provided, irrespective of the actual nature of one's contract, whether it's an employment contract or not, but basically an income replacement for those who have been left without employment in the COVID crisis, has become an unintentional, perhaps, but eye-opener, or certainly reflection opener on what a progressive version of a guaranteed basic income might look like. So broader than what we have in employment insurance, and different than some of the past experiments on guaranteed income. And I raise this in relation to employment discrimination, because one of the things that guaranteed incomes enable the most marginalized to do is to make decisions on what work they will do on the basis other than abject need, right? So they can choose better working conditions. They can create conditions that enable them to enter the labor market in a manner that is respectful of their human dignity, respectful of all of the things that I read from Chief Justice Dickson at the outset. And that then creates pathways to different life options and helps to keep pressure on challenging segmentation in the labor markets. This moment also allows us to start rethinking particular kinds of understandings of work-life balance. And as many has said, in relation to climate change, to rethink how we understand our relationship to particular forms of production and consumption. So these are much bigger strategies. They don't all fit neatly into a framing of employment discrimination law as it would classically be understood. And that's deliberate, of course, because we know that we have faced similar strategies that have not yielded the kind of change that we need. And so my takeaway message from this is that while we should, of course, continue to make human rights legislation live up to the promise that it has, it won't do it alone. The mobilizing is critical, the organizing is critical, and alongside it, there's a need to think really deeply about the alternatives that actually create space for an emancipatory vision of labor law. So thank you very much for your interest. Merci infiniment pour votre écoute et il me fera un plaisir de prendre des questions dans les deux langues.
Thank you, Dr. It was an amazing, I don't want to say class, but webinar, and was really, it was really enlightening. I will just tell people that we will stop the recording from now on for the question time. So you feel free and comfortable to ask your question with your video on if you want.